was also the same individual that authored a study about 4 or 5 years ago on the health benefits of milk, which we know is not really correct. And so it was brought out in the article that at that point that he did that research and came out with that article on milk, that he had a close alliance with the milk industry. And it also brought out in the article that not within the last few years, but prior to that, he had a close alliance with the meat industry. And so the article pointed out that there are ways of interpreting data. And there are certain methodologies that you follow as researchers. And it pointed out that the methodology that he used was not really the best, and it was probably biased by his association, past or present, with the meat industry. So, you know, you have to take everything in context. We know we have the health message. You know, milk is not good for us anymore. Meat, all kinds of meat is not good for us. And so articles like that come out, I mean, we've seen articles that have come out that say that chocolate is, is fine for you, several years ago. And of course, wine has beneficial health attributes. And that study has been widely debunked. And so we have our health message. Let's just stick with it and not worry about these other things that come out, because they're usually tainted in one way or another. We have a message from God. We'll stick with that, don't you think? Rather than research done by human beings that are biased and their views are tainted. Well, we're not living in the 1800s anymore. Okay. This week we focused on Ezra last week. When Pastor Schooley was here, and this week we're going to focus on Nehemiah. Although there is a connection, obviously, between these two books, as it was brought out. I don't remember, it was in the Teacher Helps. It wasn't in the lesson study itself, but Teacher Helps said the books of Ezra and Nehemiah originally were one unit. They were together. And then later they were split into two books. So there's a lot of commonality in these two books. And so that's why we're studying them together, pretty much kind of as a unit.
Because combined into one book, but also there's a difference between them two. Ezra was I say a preacher?
He was a priest.
Yeah. Okay, and Nehemiah became a governor. So there's a difference between them two. But they had the same purpose.
Yep.
They were doing.
Yep. To restore and rebuild Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so as we start out in our lesson study, our Sabbath afternoon introductory section talks about, at this point as we pick up our study, there are two groups had returned already to Jerusalem. The first group, which was a large group, we're told that it was about 50,000 individuals, that they returned out of Babylonian captivity to Judah under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Jeshua or Joshua, who was a priest at that time. And so we've already had that group that came back, and then there was a second group that came back, and they came back under Ezra. And so now it says here that there is one more company of exiles that God is preparing to return to Judah, essentially to the capital city of Jerusalem. Although the first two groups returned to rebuild Jerusalem and to complete part of that project by finishing the temple, okay, that was kind of the main focus when they first went back, that first group that went back under Zerubbabel. Their main focus was to rebuild the temple. The rest of the construction, that is, which would have been rebuilding Jerusalem, was abandoned as opposition from the surrounding nations arose. The people from the surrounding area didn't want the Israelites to build the city and its walls because they were afraid that the Israelites might become a mighty nation again, as they had once been. So we know that there was a lot of resistance. There was resistance to the building of the temple, and there was resistance, especially resistance, to the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem and the walls around it. So that's where we kind of enter into our lesson study this week. The first group had started back, began the construction of the temple, which had been interrupted, and certainly the rebuilding of the city was interrupted. And at the time of Nehemiah's trip back, there had been this a group that first went there under Zerubbabel that had been discouraged and had stopped in their rebuilding of the temple. But under the leadership, under the prophetic leadership of Haggai and Zechariah, they had once again been exhorted to get back and start working on the temple. And we know that that did happen, and it happened, the construction of the temple took about 20 years from the time that the first decree from Cyrus, which was around let me see. I'm sorry. I've forgotten the date of that. Oh, 537. 537. The first decree by Cyrus in 537, the temple was completed in 515. So there was about a 20-year period of time that it took the Jews that went back under Zerubbabel to complete the temple. And during that time, there was a lot of opposition. And what about the city? What about the city of Jerusalem? They finished the temple in 515. But what about the city? What kind of shape was the city of Jerusalem in?
It was broken down.
It was broken down. It was in ruins. It was in ruins.
Didn't they also interrupt because of that? The temple was built, but they were worshiping in the temple like they should because of it. They were all separated around Judah.
Yeah, they, we see that, Frank, in Haggai. And if we just turn to the first couple of chapters of Haggai, we read in chapter 1, verse 4, "It is time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste?" Okay, that's a question. Okay, is it okay for you guys, you Israelites, to dwell in your sealed, which is another way of saying like paneled houses? It's a sign of luxury. So the Jews had been building their own homes, whereas the house of God had been lying in waste. It had not been finished. That was the work of Haggai, is to rally the people again, call them out. You're living in luxury, and the house of God is lying waste. And so, where were these houses, these luxurious houses, so to speak, that the Jews were living in? Were they in Jerusalem? No, they weren't. Jerusalem was in ruins. The walls had been broken down and burnt. You know, it's interesting. I want to tread softly here, but last week, Pastor Schooley made a point of telling us that there seemed to be an inconsistency between what the prophecy says in Daniel 9:25 and the actual decree that is described in Ezra chapter 7. And he was pointing out that the prophecy of the decree says that it would be to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. And he pointed out that if you go to the decree and read about it in Ezra chapter 7, it says nothing in there about rebuilding the city. It only talks about, if you will, restoring it. Restoring what? Well, restoring it from the standpoint of full authority of the Jews to self-rule, to set up judges and magistrates, and actually to enforce their laws through fines, imprisonment, and even execution of offenders. So you could say that the decree was to restore the sovereignty of the nation of Israel. And that is in the decree. But you don't find anything, it's true, in the decree specifically about rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And I believe that Pastor Schooley said that's because the city was already rebuilt. Anybody that was here remember that? Okay, it was already rebuilt. Well, was it? No, it wasn't. So, you know, when I heard that, and that we had been somehow, as Adventists, presenting an incorrect interpretation of this prophecy in Daniel 9:25 all these years, that it wasn't really a decree to rebuild the city, it bothered me. So I spent a bit of time researching it. And honestly, as I said, I want to tread softly here because it doesn't seem to be correct. The city, obviously, at the time that Ezra went back, was in ruins. Why? Because 13 years later, when Nehemiah went back, why did he go back? Because the city was in ruins. And it even says that when he went back, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here as far as the lesson goes, but when he went back, he went to inspect the city. What did he find?
The wall all broken down.
Yeah, the walls all broken down. He went riding into the city on probably a donkey, and what happened?
Well, he went and surveyed the whole thing at night to see all the damages and make a plan.
So what are we told when he was riding into the city on his donkey? Was he able to just go wherever he wanted to go, see everything? No. He said that the debris was so great that his donkey couldn't even get through. So the city had not been rebuilt during the time between when Ezra went back in 457 and when Nehemiah went back in 444, 445. The city was still in ruins. So to say that this decree in Daniel 9:25 couldn't refer to rebuilding Jerusalem because it already had been rebuilt is just simply not true. It was in ruins. And so then the question arises, okay, if the prophecy says that the city was to be rebuilt, says the decree would be to rebuild the city, and you look at the decree and it doesn't say anything in it specifically about rebuilding the city, well, how do we reconcile that?
It's, to me, it's the word restoration. So, to me, it's complete restoration of the city and the sovereignty of the nation.
Yes, and I agree with that. To restore could mean more than just restoring the ability to self-rule, to self-government. Could be to just physical restoration, which then falls on to rebuild the city. But again, looking at the decree itself, there's nothing specifically in the decree that says you're authorized to go back and rebuild the city. Yes, Mary?
I'm trying to sort this out. Are we saying that the dates of the 2300 days, the beginning date, has changed?
Yes. Well,
Is that where we're going with this?
In Pastor Schooley never said anything like that.
I wondered all week about it, tried to study it out and figure it out.
Yeah, well, I'm not the only one then that that was kind of taken back by that. And so I really did want to get in there and study it some more. And, it does kind of raise a question about whether our dating of 457 is the correct date to align with that prophecy in Daniel 9:25.
We were wrong in 1844.
Because what was the date of the, first of all, the book of Ezra describes what happened in 457 as a decree. It describes it as a decree, which aligns with Daniel 9:25. Nehemiah, on the other hand, requested and received what? Did he receive a decree?
No,
No. What did he receive?
permission to rebuild.
Well, he received permission, but in what form?
The physical.
Letters. He requested letters, okay? Documents that he could show to these governors beyond the river. And so, one is called a decree, okay, which aligns with Daniel 9:25. The other, which happened in 445, was the result of his request for letters, which would seem much more specific and narrow in its nature. A decree would be much broader, applying to, well, it would just have an implication it's a broader document than letters, which would be more specific, to be delivered to specific individuals rather than a decree that would apply to everyone. So there does seem to be, when you look at it from that standpoint, there seems to be an alignment between 925, Daniel 9:25, and the decree issued by Artaxerxes to Ezra at the time of Ezra, not the one that he gave in letters to Nehemiah. So that's a little bit in favor of our historical understanding that 925 refers to 457, not to 445. So again, looking at the decree itself, as Peter pointed out, there's a restoration that is authorized by this decree. And 925 says it's not just a restoration, but it's to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Well, we know that the city was not rebuilt at that period of time. It was not. At the time of the decree in 457, the city was not rebuilt.
The question, I don't know, maybe I don't understand you right. The question to my mind is not when was the city rebuilt, but when was the decree?
Well, the decree of Artaxerxes was in 457, and that's widely understood and provable by a number of ancient documents. So that date is very solid, if you will. There's no question. As is the date of 445, because it specifically says it was issued 20 years after, or in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, and he came to the throne in 465. So it was 445 that he gave these letters to Nehemiah. So those dates are not really in question. The issue that Pastor Schooley was pointing out was that you cannot look at the decree issued in 457 and find anything in it about rebuilding the city of Jerusalem.
Well, maybe they didn't realize when it was issued, the decree, the state that the actual town was in, Jerusalem.
Now, when was this prophecy made in Daniel 9:25 relative to the actual issuance of the decree? How many years were between them?
Was it 20 years?
About 80 years. It was about 80 years between when Daniel received that vision and the actual issuance of the decree from Artaxerxes. 80 years. Okay. So the question is, when God gave that through Gabriel, when God gave that vision to Daniel that he wrote out, did God know that the city of Jerusalem was going to be needful of being rebuilt at the time that Artaxerxes issued his decree? Did God know that?
Knows all things.
Yeah. He knew that. He knew that the city was still going to be in ruins and needed to be rebuilt. Now, admittedly, when Ezra went back, he was not able to complete the rebuilding of the city. We know that because 13 years later, it was still in ruins. So he was not able to complete that. But does that mean that he was not, even though it does not specifically state that in the decree, in Ezra 7, would it not be implied? The city is in ruins at the time that Ezra went back. It has not been rebuilt. Would it not be implied that he had authority to build up the city? The temple had already been completed some 60 years before he went back. The temple was already there. But the city itself had not been rebuilt. And so it does not seem to me to be any kind of a stretch at all, even though you cannot read specifically in the decree of Artaxerxes depicted in Ezra 7, can't see specifically there that, okay, I'm authorizing you to go back and rebuild the city. Okay, it's not there. But God, 80 years before that decree was issued, knew that the city was going to be in ruins. And so, to me, it's no stretch at all to understand that when you're authorized to go back and establish laws and put in place magistrates and judges and enforce those laws by penalties, banishment, execution, and imprisonment, that you are obviously giving authority also to build up the physical structure in order to make all that happen.
Make it possible to do that.
To make it possible. So I don't see, a big stretch here. So bottom line, I believe that the way we have been presenting this all these years is in fact correct. And that the decree that's issued or mentioned in Daniel 9:25 does align with the decree that was issued by Artaxerxes to Ezra in 457. So I just wanted to give you my view of that because I was kind of shaken up by what Pastor Schooley said last week, and I dug into it like Mary did, wondering, wait a minute, have we been wrong all these years? Because other people, evangelicals, believe that decree applies to the letters that Nehemiah received from Artaxerxes in 445, not 457. So we have a difference of opinion there. But if you can support 457, everything lines up perfectly. Yes, Peter?
I'm going to say something that I think Pastor Schooley would agree with everything that you said, that 457 is the right date for the decree. I think his comment is the scripture doesn't specifically say rebuild Jerusalem, but he would say, like you're saying and like I'm saying, that the word restoration, with all the administration building, is a far greater thing than just rebuilding Jerusalem. It gives the sovereignty of the nation back. And I think he would agree with that. So I think just in the end of this, to say that Pastor Schooley is challenging us to take a look at it, because we may face that question.
Yes, I think it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting point that he brought up. And that's why I wanted to flesh it out a little bit this week. I wanted to add some more narrative to it. Yes, Rose?
I just wanted to point out that it does say in Ezra 7:21, and whatsoever Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of God of heaven, shall require of you, be it done speedily. So that's very broad.
That's very broad.
Very broad.
And again, God issued this prophecy through Gabriel 80 years before that decree. He knew. And as you say, that is as broad as it is wide. And so it could have certainly encompassed the physical restoration of Jerusalem, as well as the sovereignty, if you will.
And I had to tell him, we get 80 years, because wasn't it 70 years? We get the 80. Is it when about the destruction of Jerusalem, including that?
No, it's that the reign of Darius, which is, let's see, Daniel chapter 9, verse 1, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus. That is established as 538 AD. And so the decree was issued in 457. It's about 80 years. Okay? That's where the 80 years comes from.
Well, and it wouldn't make any sense to take care of the temple, not have any wall or protection of some kind around to protect it.
Well, yeah, there wasn't.
But I mean, that's why they needed to rebuild the city, too.
Well, of course, you know, they wanted not just to protect the city, they wanted to protect the temple as well. Yeah. So anyway, I thought it was worth bringing this out because I wasn't the only one that, I'm glad there was somebody else. Mary, you know, said, whoa, wait a minute, what is this all about? So I thought it was worth bringing this out and discussing it a little bit because I think absolutely our understanding of what the prophecy of Daniel 9:25 refers to is correct. It's correct. It's 457. It is not the letters issued to Nehemiah in 445. It's correct.
Just if you change the beginning date of anything, then that means the end dates all have to be changed. And everything already fits. I think all those other dates fit right in.
They fit.
If you change the first one, then you've got to change them all.
Yes. Everything fits perfectly, doesn't it, when you start from 457? It just fits perfectly. And it's not just that it fits with 1844. That is a derived date from the starting point to the end point of the 2300 years. The thing that nails it down is from the start date to the birth, baptism, death, and end of Jewish probation. That's what nails that starting date down. Those things all fall perfectly into place when you start at 457 and move forward with 490 years, 483 years, 490 years, and in the midst of the 7th year, Christ does away with sacrifices when he's crucified.
And it's worth just reminding ourselves that birth in that ministry and that death by, let's say, the evangelicals, they describe it as the Antichrist, not as birth, the ministry and the rest.
Yeah, they take that 70th week, yes, and shove it 2,000 years into the future. And it started out with the secret rapture. And that's a whole other study. Well, you know, we got about 5 or 10 minutes left here. I'd love to go into that, but we don't have time to even scratch the surface of it.
When somebody gives, the decree gave permission to go back to Jerusalem to take care of the temple, etc. When you give permission for somebody to do something, there's also implied things in there in your permission that aren't necessarily stated that are implied with the thing where it's not just the one thing that they're saying you can do.
Yeah, and yeah, that's why I said earlier, I think it can be implied rather easily. It can be implied that Ezra was authorized to build up the city of Jerusalem, even though it may not specifically state that. But as Rose pointed out, there is a rather broad statement in there that could apply to a lot of different things. So, okay, we'll move on. Let's see. So in our Sunday section, Nehemiah receives bad news. Okay, well what was the bad news? The bad news was that the city of Jerusalem was in ruins. And, you know, the lesson points out that he may have heard rumors at that point, because where is he? He's back in Babylon, which is a long way from Jerusalem. And he may have heard rumors that the city was still laying in ruins, but now he has a first-hand account that he receives from Hanani. And as a result of that, he is deeply upset over it and begins to lift the whole situation up to the Lord. And it says that he fasted, he prayed and fasted, and obviously not a fast. Well, we don't know what kind of a fast it was, but he fasted for how long?
40 days.
4 months. For 4 months. And so he, after the end of that period of time, he approaches the king, Artaxerxes. Now, Artaxerxes, this is interesting. Artaxerxes, if I read this correctly, shows up 3 times in terms of the restoration and rebuilding of Jerusalem. First of all, in response to complaints, in response to complaints about the rebuilding of the city, he does what? He issues an order to stop, to cease, until you receive a different instruction from me. So that's number 1. Number 2, he does issue another order from himself, which is the decree that he gave to Ezra in 457, which was a positive thing. Go back, restore Jerusalem. And then thirdly, he issues letters to Nehemiah. This is all the same guy. It's kind of interesting. First he stops it, and then he issues one decree, and then issues letters to Nehemiah to start it up again and get it done, and authorizing all kinds of financial support to get it done. Interesting. So this Artaxerxes was kind of all over the map, so to speak. So he fasted and prayed for 4 months, during which time the Lord worked upon the heart of the king to soften him and prepare him for what Nehemiah was going to ask him. Because it says in Nehemiah chapter 1 that he went into the king, and he was, what was his mood?
Sad.
Sorrowful, right. He was sorrowful, and the king noticed it. Now, that's a little unusual, but if we were to believe what our lesson implies, the Lord had been working on the heart of King Artaxerxes, and he noticed that that Nehemiah was sorrowful, that he wasn't his usual cheerful self. He said, what's wrong? Well, he laid it out. The city of my forefathers is laying in ruins, and I'm just depressed over it. And the king, well, what would you like me to do? Well, would you mind letting me go and go back there and take some people back there and rebuild the city? And the king's response, yeah, I'll allow you to do that. That's kind of amazing, is it not? Well, that's because during the 4 months of fasting and praying, in which Nehemiah was very patient, waiting upon the Lord was preparing the way for him to make this request and for the king to respond favorably to it. And our Monday section talks about this prayer. You know, I'm sure that this prayer was maybe offered many times during that period of time that he was fasting and praying, but we're recorded here what his prayer, one specific prayer, or basically what the body of most of his prayers looked like. And it looks very much like the prayer that's recorded in Daniel chapter 9. And it brings out that Nehemiah is in essence saying to God, remember, God, that you promised that you will scatter us when we are unfaithful, but that you will also bring us back and restore everything. Since the first one has happened, that is, you've scattered us, now it is time to fulfill the other promise you made, because we are now returning to you. So, you know, this is kind of an interesting thing. It's like Nehemiah saying, listen, Lord, you have to do this. You know, you promised to scatter us if we're unfaithful. You did that. Then you promised to bring us, you know, to bless us and bring us back. And so now it's time to do that. It's almost like, you know, Nehemiah is lecturing God about, you know, you have to do this. But we need to remember, as Mrs. White, no, I'm sorry, that's not a quote from Mrs. White, but our lesson says, it is not that God doesn't know or remember his promises. Instead, God takes pleasure in our willingness to claim his promises. This is an important point. It's a really important point. He wants us to believe in them and thus speak them out loud to him. By verbalizing what God has promised us, we can be strengthened in our own resolve to trust in those promises. So when Nehemiah is reminding God of all these things that he has said, it's not like God needed to be reminded. He knew what he had promised. But it is beneficial to Nehemiah to repeat these. And God's pleased when we call upon him to, you know, to say, these are the blessings that you promised, and I'm believing in those, and I'm asking you, you know, for those blessings as you promised. That's a good, healthy thing. You know, we remember that Moses was negotiating with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember that? Well, God didn't need to be negotiated with. He already knew what he was going to do. But he allowed Moses, you know, to plead for these people, to plead for them, and to, in essence, bring it to a point where if there were just one person that could be saved in Sodom or Gomorrah, thank you, that God would spare them both. The point was that there wasn't. And he allowed Moses to go through this whole thing to show that there was not one individual in either one of those cities that was righteous. It was not that Moses was...
Wasn't it Abraham?
Abraham, sorry. That's in Genesis chapter 18.
You're right, Moses pleaded for the nation of Israel, but Abraham pleaded for Sodom and Gomorrah.
That little mixed up there.
Yes, you're right. Abraham, sorry. It's Abraham, okay. Wrong person, same concept. That, you know, God didn't need to be pleaded with. God didn't need to be negotiated with. He already knew what the result was going to be. Then it was Moses that pled for the nation of Israel. Yes. In Exodus 32, you know, he said, you know, you need to spare these people because you brought them out, and if you destroy them, it's going to destroy your reputation. Well, did God not know that? Of course he did. So we do not negotiate, we do not instruct God in anything.
But when we're reviewed by God's Spirit, then like Moses and like Abraham, we intercede and plead because they had that spirit of intercession. They were like Christ.
Yes, and that's another part of the lesson that we learn from that, isn't it? That just like Nehemiah, 4 months, he pled and prayed and fasted. And God honored that. Just like he honored the plea of Abraham and Moses. So yes, if we're sincere and we ask for something, asking that God would hear us and respond, absolutely. That's a lesson to be learned from this as well. But God's way ahead of us. That's the other point. He's way ahead of us. He already knows what's going to happen. So anyway, okay, enough about that. Well, we're out of time. I don't know that there's anything else here that I'd really like to bring out in the next 30 seconds. So Nehemiah returns. I guess the last final thing is when he goes back, what's the reception that he gets from the governors of these nations that are surrounding Judah when he gives them the letters that Artaxerxes had given him?
They're not happy.
They're not happy. And I think probably the last thing we'll do is we will look at Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 19. And when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard about it, in other words, when they received these letters, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, "What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king?" Okay, well, he answers them and says, well, the Lord's on our side and we're going to go ahead, regardless of what you may think. Do you remember one other instance in the Bible where it says somebody was laughed to scorn? Sarah?
You know, she left.
Okay, that may be true. I don't remember.
Yeah, when they said that she was going to have a baby, and she left.
Well, okay. Yes, that's right. She laughed. But specifically, somebody was laughed to scorn. Anybody remember that? When Jesus entered in to the inner chamber where Jairus' daughter was laying, and all the mourners were, he said, no, she's just asleep. And what did they do to Jesus? They laughed him to scorn because they didn't believe that she was not dead. And Jesus said, no, she's just asleep. They laughed him to scorn. Well, they were wrong, just like these governors of these nations that were surrounding Judah were wrong. So, okay, we'll have to conclude our study. Let's have prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you as always for your word. Your word is truth. And you said, sanctify them with your word because your word is truth. So we're thankful for being able to study together this morning, and just bless us now as we dismiss, which we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. do that?
Here we go.